Good morning. My name is Frank Gaffney. I'm the president of the Center for Security Policy, also doing business as Secure Freedom. We are presenting the second in a series of what we call Iran Truth Squads for the purpose of trying to make sure that as the United States government, in all of its component parts, considers and acts upon a negotiation and the fruits of the negotiation with the Islamic Republic of Iran, it is doing so on the basis of the facts, the actual nature of both the Iranian regime and the kinds of activities that it's engaged in, and the possibilities of doing something to mitigate those activities through negotiations on the basis of reality, not wishful thinking. I'm joined by eminent figures with detailed knowledge about various aspects of this particular portfolio. I will introduce them in turn. We have on my left Ken Timmerman, an investigative journalist of the first order, an author of numerous best-selling books, quite a number of them dealing with Iran. We are grateful to him for his work in the public policy arena as well, notably as the founder and president of the Foundation for Democracy in Iran. He has been active, among other things, in helping those who are victims of terrorism, notably those enabled by the Iranian regime, and brings to us a great wealth of personal insights and history that will inform our consideration of the nature of the regime we're dealing with and why any deal with such a regime is fraught. Next to Ken Timmerman is the chairman of the Center's Military Committee, a man who has distinguished himself in uniform, notably as a naval officer, rising through the ranks from a seaman to a four-star admiral, and ultimately the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, the U.S. Pacific Fleet. He is Admiral James A. Ace Lyons. Admiral Lyons has also a wealth of personal history with the Iranian regime, including on a number of occasions having worked on and undertaken to punish the Iranians for the various acts of terrorism and other predations that it has engaged in since coming to power in 1979. We're very honored to have him with us to talk particularly about the military aspects of what the Iranians are up to and the strategic as well as tactical implications of empowering them further with either nuclear weapons or billions of dollars with which to buy more of those, and also to engage in terrorism and subversion and the rest. On my right is my colleague at the Center for Security Policy, Clare Lopez, our Vice President for Research and Analysis. Clare is, by training and personal practice, deeply knowledgeable in this portfolio, drawing on her time as a clandestine officer in the Central Intelligence Agency, as well as someone who has been active in a number of organizations over the years, specializing really on the Iranian threat and how best to counter it. Clare will be talking about the deal that President Obama is trying to finish in the next 2 months, we're told, with the Iranians, specifically with respect to their nuclear weapons ambitions. Before inviting Ken Timmerman to make some comments, let me just sort of set the stage briefly. We're, of course, having this conversation in the aftermath of the United States Senate yesterday, voting by 98-1 to endorse a piece of legislation known by the names of its two principal co-sponsors, Senator Bob Corker of Tennessee and Senator Cardin of Maryland, Ben Cardin of Maryland. They have secured the Senate's endorsement for legislation that I personally find deeply problematic, most especially because it actually seems to eviscerate one of the Senate's constitutional responsibilities, namely to advise and consent to treaties. The argument here is that the president is refusing to submit this agreement, if he gets it, as a treaty. My own personal feeling is anything of this import must be a treaty and must be considered as such. Sadly, the Senate has gone along with the idea that it won't be and has now come up with an arrangement whereby they will have 30 days to consider what the president submits, and the sanctions that are currently in place, U.S. sanctions at least, are not to be alleviated in that time. The Congress can act under this agreement or this bill, but only basically by mustering a 2/3 vote to disapprove the agreement in both the Senate and House can they actually stop this agreement. It's now clear from both what we've seen in the Senate and what I think will be coming more and more evident in the coming days in the House that that is not a bar that can be overcome. As a result, the deal that the president submits, whatever its terms, will effectively not only be adopted with his signature, but formally embraced by the United States Congress. For reasons that we'll be talking about in the course of this panel discussion, that will be, I believe, a mortal peril to the people of the United States, to our friends and allies in Israel, and others who are also in the target set of the Iranian regime. Let me simply close by saying that the House of Representatives is, in fact, where the action will be next week, we're told. The Speaker of the House seems determined to move forward with the Corker-Cardin bill. It remains to be seen what kinds of amendments will be offered, whether any of them will be able to muster a majority. But again, for the reasons that we'll be talking about today, it is my view that it is absolutely imperative that this deal be blocked, that amendments at a minimum be adopted to the Corker-Cardin legislation, and better yet, that it be replaced by something that would return to the regular order, which Republican leaders made much of when they were given, once again, the majority in this Congress, that they would return to the regular order, by which I think they meant, certainly we should all think of the constitutional order, by which the Congress, the Senate specifically, must approve by a 2/3 majority treaties, particularly of this kind of potential consequence. So with that, let me turn the floor over to my friend and colleague Ken Timmerman in the hope that he will further develop this idea that the nature of the Iranian regime is one that makes all of these efforts so potentially fraught. Right. Ken Timmerman, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Frank, and thanks to all who are listening here today. I've been tracking the Iranian regime since its inception, actually, first in Paris as a young reporter, in Lebanon, where I saw the effects of Iranian terrorism face to face, first at the U.S. Embassy bombing in April of 1983, and then later on with the U.S. Marine Corps bombing that October. Turns out that Ace and I almost crossed paths at a distance later that fall. I was on the ground in northern Lebanon when the airplanes, it was only the French. You were going to launch U.S. aircraft, and they were pulled back by Cap Weinberger, I believe. But I was on the ground when we saw the French superétendard going overhead to bomb the Iranians in Baalbek for their responsibility in killing 241 U.S. Marines and 61 French Marines in Beirut that October. I want to tell you a little story about Iran's nuclear programs, their ambitions. In 1995, I had an opportunity to make a presentation at a pugwash conference of all things, a arms control group in Italy, and I was talking about the legend of Iran's nuclear program, and I said at that point, and I used the term legend as the way an intelligence analyst would use it. Iran was using the fiction of a civilian nuclear program to disguise its nuclear weapons intentions. And I laid out a series of things that the Iranians had done, procurement in particular, and the types of facilities we knew that they were building then. This is 1995, okay, 20 years ago. And in one of the panelists there was an Iranian government official who was supposedly engaged in non-proliferation affairs. Essentially, he was an intelligence officer tracking what we were looking at to report back to the Iranian regime what Western officials and analysts were looking at and knew. And I had the opportunity to spend a couple of evenings walking through the streets of Bologna, Italy, with this individual, who I will not name for his own safety today. And after 2 nights of this, he essentially admitted, well, Ken, of course it's a nuclear weapons program, but we don't intend to build a weapon now. We just want to have the ability, should the political decision be made, and to have the capabilities to be able to quickly make a weapon when the leader decides it's an opportune time. Now, that was 20 years ago. That was 20 years ago. That same year, 1995, the Iranians yet again demonstrated their intentions. They signed a deal with Russia to rebuild a nuclear reactor at Bushehr, a civilian nuclear power reactor. And in the original deal that they signed, there were 2 components that many of us who looked at it found very troubling. One was that the Russians had agreed to build an entire turnkey uranium enrichment plant using centrifuges. And the second was that they had offered to build a uranium test shaft. Now, we were wondering whether there was some problem with the translation between Russian and English or whatever it was, but even Bill Clinton found that a little bit troubling. And when he met with Boris Yeltsin in Moscow in May of 1995, he got the Russians to take out those 2 aspects of their nuclear agreement with Iran. And as Yeltsin presented it, again, this is 20 years ago, he said, we have, upon the recommendation of my good friend Bill Clinton, we have decided to omit the military aspects of our nuclear agreement with Iran. The military aspects. Now, I must say, I appreciate when a world leader is frank and honest. It's so rare. So here you have Boris Yeltsin, president of the Russian Federation, acknowledging in front of the cameras that centrifuge enrichment in Iran was a military program. Acknowledging it openly. Now, here's yet another little factoid that kind of gets forgotten as we look at what Iran is doing today. In that same agreement, where the Russians agreed to build the Bushehr nuclear plant, which today is sort of operating, sort of not. It depends on the day and what's going on and the viruses that infect the computer systems and I guess how many nuclear scientists or technicians show up that day for work and how many had accidents on their way to work. But in that same deal, the Russians offered to provide Iran with a 10-year supply of nuclear fuel. A 10-year supply of nuclear fuel for $30 million. Now that's a pretty darn good deal. I mean, that is rock bottom. That is a rock bottom price. And in addition, to sweeten it, the Russians said, hey, not only will we provide you the fuel, for the reactor, but we'll take it away. So you don't have to worry about all those environmentally nasty things, such as spent fuel. And of course, the Iranians, because they really wanted to have civilian power reactors, they said yes, right? No. They said, no. We're not interested in your very good rock-bottom priced uranium fuel and reprocessing for free. We would much rather than spend $30 million for that, we would much rather spend $1 billion, $2 billion, incur international wrath, sanctions, isolation, and build our own centrifuge enrichment plants so we are in control of the nuclear fuel cycle. And that is, in fact, what they proceeded to do. Now, what does it mean when Iran is in control of the nuclear fuel cycle, which they are today? It means essentially they can enrich as much uranium as they want, wherever they want to, and the only way that we in the West or in the free world have any control over that is by a very complicated process of monitoring exports of high technology items to Iran, hoping that by chance we'll be able to catch certain parts that are necessary for the centrifuge enrichment plant and piece all that together through analysis and say, my gosh, they're buying enough ring magnets for 30,000 centrifuges, and they say they've only got 8,000. Or we depend on the goodwill of the Iranians to declare all of their facilities to the International Atomic Energy Agency, and then we send inspectors in who, of course, find those 30,000 centrifuges. Well, obviously, that's not happening either, and that is not going to happen. And that is one of the biggest problems, I think, with this deal. I know that Clare is going to talk about that specifically. But the fact that we have no baseline for where the Iranian program is, because they have refused to answer questions from the International Atomic Energy Agency about their past military activities, about their experiments to make specific warhead components. We have no clue, at least publicly, where the secret facilities lie, but we are pretty sure that they exist because a couple of them have been exposed in the past, and one of them, Fordow, is a part of this agreement. Now, the Iranians, remember, Ahmadinejad, when he was president, had promised to build 10 Fordows. What do we know? What do we know? Whether they built 2, 6, 8, or just the one at Fordow, we really don't know. And so far, the CIA has not been forthcoming, at least publicly, to tell us what they know, if anything. My good friend Reza Khalili, who used to be a CIA undercover agent in Iran in the early parts of the revolution, believes that he has uncovered at least 2 additional facilities. And I know people, defectors that I've worked with, who have pointed at another 1 or 2 as well. But again, these have not been declared to the IAEA. They are not subject to inspections. They are not part of the agreement, which means that the Iranians can go merrily along, enriching as they will, and we just won't know where they are. One final point let me make, and this is perhaps, in my mind, the most disturbing of all. We know for a fact that the Iranian nuclear and missile programs are in fact joint programs with North Korea. Why do I say we know this for a fact? Well, I know it personally because of sources of mine who were involved in the original negotiation of that deal by Mohsen Rezaei when he was the head of the Revolutionary Guards Corps in 1993. And when he went to North Korea to negotiate the deal, one of the people that I was involved in happened to be his son, who was later murdered by the regime, was there with him and basically told me the story of their negotiations with North Korea on ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons. Okay? The other reason that we know this for a fact is because even the US intelligence community has acknowledged that every time that there is a nuclear weapons test in North Korea, about a week ahead of time, there's an Iranian military Boeing 737 that arrives, full of Iranian nuclear technicians and Rev Guards officers who come there to, quote, observe the test. And every time the Iranians test a long-range missile in Iran, there is a plane load of North Korean missile technicians who come to Iran to observe the test. These are joint programs. Now, the intelligence community recently, here in the United States, made an absolutely astonishing revelation, which has been repeated now on the floor of the United States Senate, that North Korea today has 20 nuclear warheads. 20. I was floored when I heard that out of the mouths of a U.S. senator. And they said within a year, they could have another 20. That's 40. 40 nuclear weapons. Now, do you believe for an instant that those are all North Korean weapons? Do you believe that North Korea has the money to enrich that much uranium or reprocess that much plutonium? Do you believe that North Korea has the program to be able to assimilate those kind of weapons? Do they have the military doctrine? So when you look at the North Korean program, you look at Iran and its intentions and the way it is toying with us, that is playing with us. It is toying with our naivete, especially the naivete of our chief negotiator. You really are worried, I think, for the future of this country. And when you look at Iran's tests of satellites being launched in a south to north trajectory, something that the Center for Security Policy has been talking about for some time, where we do not have missile defense radar in place to be able to track them. They have a capability, I believe, now, a capability, I don't know that it's the deployed capability, but they have a capability that they have demonstrated through tests to deploy an electromagnetic pulse warhead over the United States in that particular trajectory. This is a potentially catastrophic security situation that we have walked ourselves into through the actions of the President of the United States and his chief advisors.
Ken, thank you very much. Let me just pick up on that last point to say, if one is interested in learning more about this danger of electromagnetic pulse and the threat that it poses to our country existentially, I commend you this little booklet. It's called Guilty Knowledge, What the U.S. Government Knows About the Vulnerability of the U.S. Electric Grid, but Refuses to Fix. It compiles a number of studies, the executive summaries of a number of studies that have looked at one aspect or another of this threat to our grid, including notably that could be mounted, I think you're right, Ken, at any point by the Iranians, or for that matter, the North Koreans, with devastating effect through the use of an electromagnetic pulse attack. To talk a bit more about the dangers inherent in the deal that President Obama is now negotiating and the inherent problems that Ken has alluded to in trying to monitor what is actually going on in Iran that is supposedly going to be constrained by this deal, I'm very pleased to turn the floor over to my colleague, Clare Lopez.
Thanks, Frank, and thanks to all of you here today and listening and watching. You know, as Ken talked about the covert program of the Iranian nuclear weapons process, I wanted to point out that all of the negotiations, all of the back and forth that's gone on in negotiations between what's called the P5+1 permanent 5 representatives of the Security Council plus Germany with the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and Iran. And indeed, the discussion in the United States Congress has all dealt with what is known about the overt program of Iran's nuclear program. There has been no discussion in any of these venues that I know about that refers to what Ken rightly just described as an extensive covert program that the Iranians most certainly have. Now, even in the discussions ongoing in places like Geneva and Vienna and Lausanne, Switzerland, New York City at the UN, and in the U.S. Congress, what we understand, at least, to have been discussed, and perhaps through leaks, we understand that various aspects of the Iranian program have been discussed and permitted, or are anticipated to be permitted. Among these, I think the most serious concession that seems to have been granted, has been granted, is the concession that Iran will be allowed to continue enriching uranium. That was supposed to be a hard and fast line, a red line, drawn through 6 United Nations Security Council resolutions that Iran would not be able to enrich uranium. That has now been conceded, dating from the November 2013 Joint Plan of Action and on through what we term the April Fool's deal of April the 1st this year, 2015. So that has been conceded. And once again, that a regime has the ability to enrich uranium, that is one of the 3 key legs or parts of a nuclear weapons program, and perhaps the most important of all. The others, of course, being the ability to fashion a warhead, and then the delivery system to put that nuclear weapon on top of a missile and deliver it to a target. I want to mention something that was recently, again, and very surprisingly, I thought, revealed in open session of Congress. And this was back in February 2015 when Admiral William Gortney, who is the commander of NORAD and also of NORTHCOM, spoke in open session. And Ken was rightly surprised at the number of warheads that North Korea is now thought to have. Well, the testimony from Admiral Gortney is at least equally as shocking, I thought. And what he said is that North Korea has the ability to miniaturize warheads, to miniaturize nuclear warheads and to place them on top of what North Koreans have are road mobile missiles. And again, as Ken pointed out, if North Korea has these capabilities, then Iran does too. This is very much a joint operation, a joint program. I want to mention a dinner I was at a couple of nights ago. And as conversations in Washington, D.C. these days are wont to do, the topic turned to Iran. And 2 very important questions were asked that I thought I would address today, because they go to the conviction of many, including we here today, I think, the conviction that Iran is either well on the way to acquisition of a deliverable nuclear weapon, or perhaps already has one, or more. And the 2 questions asked were, what should the United States do before Iran demonstrates its deliverable nuclear weapons capability, and what should the United States do after Iran demonstrates that capability? The underlying assumption being that it is going to, at some point in time, demonstrate a deliverable nuclear weapons capability. So I thought, given all of the concessions that have already been offered in the talks, the enrichment, the disregard of Iran's partnership with North Korea, disregard of its intercontinental ballistic missile program, the failure to stipulate and demand inspections of what are already, as Ken referred to, sites that are revealed and understood to be part of Iran's covert uranium enrichment and warhead R&D program, but not part of the talks. So in light of all of that, I think it's appropriate that we should look at these questions. What should the United States do before Iran demonstrably goes nuclear? Well, I think the #1 most important thing that we have to do is restore U.S. credibility in general. That means, and I'm sure Admiral Lyons is going to speak to this, reconstituting our military capability. Specifically, we need to demonstrate our credibility and that our word means something and that we will back our word with deeds vis-a-vis Iran. However, worldwide, demonstrating that capability will have a good effect, one might expect, on other adventuresome leaders. Vladimir Putin of Russia comes to mind, perhaps the leadership of China too. We need to end all negotiations with Iran and stop releasing any funds, stop releasing any frozen funds that are in Western banks, stop the lifting of sanctions to the extent that we're able, at least unilaterally and working with our P5+1 partners to do that internationally, multilaterally. I would suggest that we need to establish a blue ribbon panel, a study that would list many of the acts of war that Iran has engaged in over 36 years of this regime against the United States. Ken spoke of the attack on our Marine Corps barracks bombing, Marine Corps barracks in the bombing of 1983 in Beirut. That was just the beginning. From that point onwards to today, we've had an absolute litany of Iranian acts of war against the United States. The taking of hostages at our embassy in Tehran in 1979 as that regime came to power. The taking of hostages, the torture, murder, killing of our hostages, including Chief of Station in Beirut, Bill Buckley, Marine Corps Colonel Richard Higgins, so many more, held by Hezbollah, interrogated, tortured, murdered. The 25-year alliance of Iran with al-Qaeda, that's not spoken of. It needs to be. It needs to be revealed exactly what that alliance has brought us, and I would suggest it has brought us more attacks. Khobar Towers in 1996, East Africa embassy bombings in 1998, USS Cole 2000, and yes, the attacks of 9/11 as well. That blue ribbon panel needs to expose Iranian support to terrorist organizations like Hamas, Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Taliban, and all the Iraqi Shiite terror militias whose IEDs cause such havoc, killing and maiming American troops in that country for years that are not spoken of. Those casualties not spoken of. They need to be. The history of the covert nuclear weapons program, of course, should be part of this study as well. We need also then to revitalize and renew our alliances. In particular, this begins with Israel in the Middle East, I think with Jordan, and certainly with the Kurds. These alliances are vital to American national security in the region. We need to tell Iran that its puppet regimes in Baghdad and Damascus are up to its regime to defend if they want to. We're not going to help them hang on to their satrapies. But we will stand by our allies, and that means Israel, Jordan, and the Kurds. And if need be, we will demonstrate a commitment to keeping open the oil flow, keeping open the sea lanes, in particular the choke points at straits like Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb. We need to issue an ultimatum to Iran. They either come clean about their past clandestine, covert nuclear weapons program, as the IAEA and the UN Security Council have demanded, but not insisted upon. They come clean with all of those open suspect sites that the IAEA has requested to visit, open those 2 inspections, seeking P5+1, our allies' support with this, seeking the UN Security Council support, knowing that we may not get much of it, but then telling the Iranians that either they come clean on this or we will lead a campaign worldwide to reimpose the toughest sanctions that can be obtained until they do come clean. We should also declare that the Iranian regime is not the legitimate regime. It is not representative of its people. We saw this demonstrated in the millions, by millions of Iranians in the streets in 2009 after the fraudulent presidential elections of that summer. We need to declare regime change as official policy of the United States. and open full support and cooperation with Iranian opposition elements, the full spectrum of those opposition elements, exiles, women's groups, student groups, labor unions, and of course the ethnic minorities throughout Iran, which are at least make up 50% of that population. So what do we do in this short window that is certainly closing, and then what do we do after it's closed? I need to mention one more thing, which Frank just talked about, and that is we have a very small window to harden our electric grid, to secure our civilian electric grid. If we are convinced that both North Korea and Iran have nuclear weapons and the missile delivery systems that can put them over our homeland, our territory, and indeed the Pentagon has issued a report on multiple occasions, multiple years, put out a report that says that Iran's ICBMs would have the range to reach continental United States of America from Iran this year, 2015. If we believe that those are true, that those are facts, then leaving our civilian electric grid as it is now completely unsecured and unprotected is completely irresponsible and inviting catastrophe. And we heard also the suggestion, not the suggestion, it is an imperative to establish a missile defense system along our eastern Atlantic shore and the southern Gulf shore. What if the window closes? What if Iran demonstrates its nuclear weapons capability sooner rather than later? Things change a lot at that point. At that point, we're in a very different situation. This will be a situation that we've never, ever faced before, that a regime with an apocalyptic vision, an apocalyptic eschatology that looks to welcome Armageddon, not to avoid it, would be then in possession of deliverable nuclear weapons. That's not the case when the Soviet Union went nuclear or China went nuclear. This would be different. So at this point, we would have to take a very careful stock of where we are in terms of our national security, because this would be a direct threat to the homeland, not just the region in the Middle East, not just our allies and partners in that region, or even of Europe, but the United States would be at risk. We need to project and declare, demonstrate that resolve. That's at the head of my list for the pre-demonstration agenda. We need to augment our military forces, and I'm sure that Admiral Lyons is going to speak more about this, in particular our naval forces. We need to ensure that Israel has all of the defensive means that it needs, that we can help it with. This means continuing to fund Iron Dome, the research on it and its successor, other missile defense systems, ensure that Israel has bunker busters and the aircraft to deliver them. Renew that defense commitment to Israel, augment it as well. Then reassure our Gulf Cooperation Council partners, these are our partners in the Persian Gulf region, reassure them, who are at this point very, very nervous about Iranian capabilities and where they will stand when those capabilities become operational in nuclear terms. They need to be reassured by us that we will stand by them, that we will back them, that we will help them with the defensive means that they need, perhaps advanced radar, perhaps missile defense systems for themselves. Use the occasion of joint training exercises and intelligence sharing as appropriate on Iran with them. The objective here, more than anything, will be to forestall or to prevent a nuclear arms race in the Persian Gulf region, which is where we're headed if those countries are convinced that we are going to let Iran go nuclear. They will want the same. And then we have to simply unleash the full capabilities of the U.S. government against the Iranian regime, short of all-out warfare. And that means, again, support for regime change, using intelligence and covert operations, the ideological means at our disposal for a propaganda war, building those regional alliances, and by the way, keep it on fracking. Keep on achieving, moving towards the achievement of energy independence for the United States. And then, of course, renewing and amplifying the sanctions against Iran. So these would be the two scenarios that I might foresee before Iran goes nuclear, demonstrably, and afterwards.
Claire, thank you very much. Let me just add, in connection with her point about a strategy for dealing with this sort of contingency, preferably before Iran actually has the bomb, and certainly if it obtains it. We have, again, at the Center for Security Policy, something we call the Secure Freedom Strategy. Many of those present have participated in its preparation, and I commend it to you as a plan for giving actual substance to the efforts that Claire has just talked about in terms of what we can do about this problem. Last but hardly least, our chairman of the Military Committee at the Center for Security Policy, Admiral A. Lyons, to talk a bit further about the military implications of what we're talking about here and the degree to which they have largely not been factored in, it would appear, to the deliberations that this body and its Senate counterpart have engaged in to date. Admiral, welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Frank. And, you know, when Frank asked me to speak here today, because I've always had the first question that comes to my mind, why are we even in negotiations with this evil rogue regime? It makes absolutely no sense. Here they've been at war with us for over 35 years. And it started before the Marine barracks blow up, let me tell you. It started under the Carter administration when they took over our embassy. And we missed a great opportunity then where we could have cut off the Ayatollah Khomeini's theocracy at the knees. But President Carter and all his successors have all failed the test when they had the opportunity to change the course of history. And as Ken mentioned, our paths almost did cross in Lebanon, but I want to correct one thing. We did have the planes loaded. We were ready to take out the core group of Hezbollah, which were at the Sheikh Abdullah barracks above Baalbek. Now, we'll go into all the background, but we did have the planes loaded. We would have been in and out in 2 minutes. We were going to make those barracks look like a plowed cornfield in Iowa. The guy that sabotaged the strike was none other than the Secretary of Defense. Now, you might say, why would he do that? What? Never. Well, the only answer, and Claire, I have to give her credit here, that it was the Iran lobby, which has great influence. Nothing else makes really much sense to me. But somebody got to him, not only once, twice, 3 times. Ken mentioned the French planes flying over. What really happened there, President Reagan approved a combined strike with the French. I had Jerry Tuttle, who was the carrier task force commander there, share our strike plans with the French. And what happened this time, why we didn't participate? Because the Secretary of Defense would not issue the orders. I have personally talked to George Shultz, Bud McFarlane, who told me they pleaded with him to release the execute orders. He refused to do it. He should have been fired on the spot. He came back and told, and you will read in President Reagan's diary, that, well, it really wasn't necessary for us to go. The French totally wiped them out, which is pure BS. What they did, they dropped 2 500-pound bombs and killed a goat. We had the opportunity to wipe out the core group of Hezbollah. And lest you all forget, our failure to act became Osama bin Laden's rallying cry. The Americans can't suffer casualties. They will cut and run. And in the eyes of the Middle East, that's what we did. And we're suffering to this day. And just to add another little footnote here, when we did the strike in Libya, you all will recall that the French refused to grant us overflight rights. And we had to have a 7,000-mile flight around the Iberian Peninsula. The reason they wouldn't grant us overflight rights because they were still totally PO'd over the fact that we backed out of the combined strike in Lebanon. Here we have a country that has caused the loss of thousands of American lives, which some have been mentioned today. Now, let's not leave out the blow-up of our embassy in Beirut in April 1983. We had 64 people were killed, and most importantly, our key Mideast CIA analyst, Bob Ames, and we had a number of others. And of course, that followed with the Marine barracks blow-up. But we've had the Khobar Towers. We've had in the Iraq War over a third of our fatalities can be directly attributed to Iran's side of the equation, who is providing those deadly IEDs and other military training and material equipment support to our enemies. So here we go. You have the announcement of the framework. And what's the first thing that comes out of the Iranian side? You have the Iranians said, this is great, wonderful. Essentially, they got everything they wanted. They called it the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, which I'm probably saying it wrong. But what that is, that was Mohammed's treaty with the tribes in Mecca. And he made it because he wasn't strong enough to wipe them out. And after, I think, a period of, 7 to 10 years, when he built up his strength, he went in and totally slaughtered them. So the Iranians, view this agreement on the framework in the same context as Mohammed did with his treaty with the tribes of Mecca. Never forget that. And I want to back up one bit and cover a point. In 1987, we were going to totally shut Iran down. And we had the capability, and I won't go into all of that. We couldn't get the orders to execute. And a few months later, you recall, we shot down an Iranian civilian airliner. It was accidental. But Khomeini thought we meant it. And he stated, I must drink from the chalice of poison. He made a truce with Saddam Hussein, something he vowed he would never do, because he viewed the airliner shoot down that we were coming in on the side of Saddam Hussein. Just think of what we could have done had we been able to execute the strike in August of '87. But the other key point here to recall, it was at that point he gave the go-ahead for the nuclear weapon program. Now, There's never, even though it's been repeated many times, there's no fatwa on not against developing a nuclear weapon capability. That's a figment of the media, and that has been perpetuated, regretfully, by a number of leaders throughout the world. But it's totally false. Now, we need to, there's one other thing to keep in mind. You know, in the mindset of the Muslim world is you do anything you want to do to advance the cause of Islam. And it's called taqiyya, lying to the infidels. And make no mistake, we're the infidels here. So it's another factor to take into consideration, which I've always said, and any type of agreement means absolutely nothing in the minds of the Ayatollah Khomeini's theocracy. And the other thing you should keep in mind is, foremost in their objectives is the sustainment of the theocracy. And that's why they went ahead and signed that truce with Saddam Hussein, because they were afraid if we came in, the theocracy would be eliminated. Now, and there's one other thing they mentioned after the framework agreement was announced. Besides the treaty aspects, they made one other declaration. The elimination of Israel is non-negotiable. A clear slap in the face of the President of the United States. You know, you have to ask, why is this man continuing with this unconscionable set of negotiations? Well, I want to take you back to an article that was written in August of 2014 by Michael Ledeen. And in that article, he said, after then candidate Obama received the Democratic nomination for presidency in June of 2008, he opened up a secret channel with Iran. The secret channel was Ambassador William G. Miller, former ambassador to Ukraine, but more importantly, he had previous tours in Tehran and spoke fluent Farsi. And the message that Miller delivered was from candidate Obama: don't sign any agreement now that's being negotiated, particularly under the Bush administration. You will like my policies. I am a friend of Iran. How can these are bordering on treason? How can he be a friend of a rogue state that has cost thousands of American lives? And I left out one point on that. We should never forget it was Iran's training, military training, and key support to the 9/11 hijackers, which permitted them to successfully carry out that strike that killed 3,000 innocent Americans who were doing nothing more than going to work. Without that support, the strike could not have been carried out. And here we have our president communicating to them, I'm your friend. Well, you have to go back. How could he make such a statement? Well, you got to go back to his declaration 6 days before he took his first oath of office, when he announced he was going to fundamentally transform America. Well, what did that mean? You know, you kind of, what does it mean? It means Why would you, if you loved America and you believed in its greatness and in exceptionalism, what is it you would want to change? You know, the true American would want to build on that reputation. Apparently, that was not the case, because the strategy we've seen unfolding is anti-American, anti-Western, pro-Islam, pro-Iranian, and pro-Muslim Brotherhood. This cannot be easily dismissed. You know, we should not forget, we've heard of different options of ways that Iran could conduct a strike and so forth. Not mentioned so far has been they've already test-fired a missile from a freighter. That could be easily done in the Caribbean or any one of our coasts. They have a missile site in Venezuela. I've talked to Ambassador Noriega on this, and he has confirmed such a site exists, and it has to be eliminated. You know, I still believe in the Monroe Doctrine, if nobody else in this administration does. And we certainly ought to pull it into play when we see what's going on in Cuba today. Now, you know, you have to say, what are the implications now if once Iran achieves the nuclear weapon capability? Well, look at all the acts of war they've taken against the United States and our allies with no weapon. You know, even when they were in a life and death struggle with Iraq, they still conducted acts of war against us. And we did nothing. You know, there seems to be no limit on the aggression and the offenses they can take against us that will cause any administration, be it Republican or Democrat, to take the appropriate action and to preserve our integrity and honor, and never forget the thousands of lives that have been lost to the Iranians today. You know, I need to mention that I'm getting the hook again from Frank. One other thing, Bernard Lewis, the noted scholar, has stated a number of times, if Iran gets the nuclear weapon, deterrence will not work. He's absolutely correct with their apocalyptic mindset for a variety of reasons. Deterrence is not a factor. In fact, if they get it, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is dead. You have to understand that. We will start a nuclear arms race throughout the Middle East. So what's the answer? The answer is we have to conduct a military strike on at least 4 sites that we're aware of and totally wipe it out. Now, when Secretary Gates was still at the Pentagon, he said, well, that'll only buy us 2 years. Well, let me tell you, I'll take those 2 years, and if they rebuild it, we take them out again. Will that happen under this administration? Not in my wildest dreams. Regretfully, it's left up to our good ally and friend Israel to conduct a strike. And what we should be doing is providing Israel with all the support to make it a successful strike. We have the capability to do it, even with the unilateral disarmament of our forces that has gone on for these almost 7 years now, but we still retain the capability to take out that nuclear infrastructure. which, if we had any honor, integrity, that's what we should be doing. Thanks very much.
Admiral Lyons, thank you very much. We're going to just engage in a little bit of back and forth here, and then if there are questions from those in the room, we'll take them. I want to pick up on something that you said at the end of your remarks, Admiral, and that is we have a president who came to office avowing that he wanted to rid the world of nuclear weapons. He has made, as you've just indicated, some progress in ridding the world of our nuclear weapons, but not so much those of adversaries of this country. In fact, I think, if anything, we've seen very ominous nuclear buildups in all of the threatening quarters. But talk, if the three of you would, about the implications of this deal, as it's now looming, on the calculations of the Saudis, perhaps the Egyptians, perhaps the Turks, perhaps others in the Gulf Cooperation Council, as to whether they can rely on our deterrence or whether they better get their own. And if so, and Ken, this is particularly to you, as you've tracked these things for many years, whether indeed nuclear non-proliferation will be essentially eviscerated worldwide, because the nature of this deal, and I'm struck, I think it was you who was talking about the relationship between the Iranians and the North Koreans. A similar kind of process brought us a nuclear disarmament deal with the North Koreans. And you think they now have 20, soon maybe 40 nuclear weapons.
20, anyway.
This is the trajectory presumably we're on, but what does it mean beyond the four corners of this agreement for nuclear weaponry, arms control, deterrence?
Yeah. You're absolutely right, and I think we're headed towards a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. Admiral Lyons mentioned it as well. You have an Islamic regime in Iran, and let's be very clear what we're talking about. We're not talking about the nation of Iran, the state of Iran, the country of Iran. We're talking about a regime which has imposed itself on the people, which does not have the support of the majority of the Iranian people, in my opinion, and we saw that in 2009 when you had millions of people on the streets demanding their freedom. But you have a regime which is powerful, which has all the means of repression, which is on its way to getting nuclear weapons, and a United States which is feckless and refused to take any action whatsoever. On the contrary, we have enabled the Iranian regime to assert its dominance over Iraq, over Lebanon, over Syria, and now over Yemen. One of the pleasant ironies I see in this situation, unusually so, is that as the United States has created a power vacuum, we've refused to shore up our to be an Iranian mullah in Tehran building nuclear, and more difficult to be in Israel building an apartment in your capital, Jerusalem, as an American friend. So what's happened? Israel's found a new ally in Saudi Arabia. So we're learning now that the Israelis and the Saudis are working to create some form of deterrent against the Iranian regime. And for the nonce, this will be a conventional military deterrent. Again, a sad irony and a sad commentary on this president. President Obama has warned that should Israel launch military airstrikes, which, by the way, I think is the last thing that the Israelis want to do. This is what I've understood from my conversation with Israeli security leaders. And they have plenty of other methods of intervening to at least stall the Iranian nuclear weapons program, besides just brute military force. But nevertheless, should it come to that, Obama has warned the Israelis that we won't let them go through Iraqi airspace, we'll shoot their planes down. So now we're in a situation where Israel, should they ever come to that situation, will go through Saudi Arabia, which will not shoot their planes down and allow them to go to Iran.
And hopefully provide them the tanker support they need.
Did you want to comment on that beyond what you've already said?
Well, it is the one feasible way for Israel to carry out such a military strike. and hopefully that the Saudis would provide the necessary air refueling support, which would be critical to a successful executed strike.
Claire, could I ask you, if you want to speak to this too, do so, but also one of the other things that has emerged in the course of the post-framework agreement conversations and leaks is the prospect that the president will provide up to $50 billion in unfrozen assets that are currently being held by us in Iranian accounts. You touched on this in your comments that we shouldn't be doing this. What are the implications for all of the kinds of activities that we've been hearing about that the Iranians are engaging in before they get the bomb? Not just before they get the bomb, but in the midst of these negotiations. If they have this windfall of $50 billion, or perhaps even more, with which to do as they wish.
Well, exactly. I would mention very quickly just two indicators to watch on the prior question about the potential for nuclear proliferation in the region. Number one is Saudi Arabia, which according to various investigative journalist reports going back at least a decade, has been in negotiations or discussions with the Pakistanis, who, as we'll recall, were among the very earliest of the supporters for the Iranian nuclear weapons program when it got started back in the 1980s. Those discussions with Pakistan about some kind of an agreement to provide the Saudis a capability, not more certainly described than that, but a capability. We know that the Saudis already have missiles, but a nuclear capability to go with that. Those discussions already have been going on for at least a decade. Furthermore, we also know that in the wake of these discussions currently now underway with the Iranians, senior Saudi officials have indicated that, well, whatever the Iranians get, we want that too. And then one other point on that is Egypt. I don't know how many people realize, but Egypt has long mastered the capability to enrich uranium. Egypt enriches its own uranium. Now, I'm not saying that it has a weapons program. I don't think that it does. But it has that key capability component that could contribute to a weapons program in the future sometime if they chose to go that way. To your question, Frank, about this windfall that looks likely to come Iran's way, $50 billion in funds that are currently held and frozen in Western banks, potentially to be unfrozen and given back to the Iranians. That's a huge amount of money. Now, our administration likes to talk about how much the sanctions regime has caused the Iranian people to suffer. Their economy undoubtedly took a big hit over the years that the sanctions bit down harder and harder. But I'll say two things about that. One, if you follow the IAEA quarterly reports from the period when the sanctions first began to dig in hard against the Iranians up until the current time, that is the period of time when the Iranian nuclear weapons program accelerated quite a lot. Accelerated in terms of numbers of centrifuges spinning, in terms of how much uranium was being spun up or enriched to higher levels of enrichment, and also in the proliferation of sites, both the sites that have become known like Fardo and clandestine sites that we may not know about yet. So the sanctions, in at least some aspect, serve to spur the Iranian program to go faster and get done before the economy got worse. So the economy did take a hit. But when these funds, and they likely will, become available to the Iranians, I think it's pretty foolish to think that the Iranian regime is going to turn immediately and dedicate those funds to reconstituting its economy. For one thing, the economy already is bouncing back quite nicely, thank you very much, because of sanctions already lifted and the ability to get more of its oil to market. Its unemployment is down, its inflation rate is down, and its trade in oil and contracts are up. That's already right now before releasing any more of this $50 billion or more. So it would be foolish to think that those proceeds are going to go to help the suffering Iranian people. When has this regime ever considered truly the needs, the aspirations of its own people? Since the revolution, it has not. Where that money will go, more than likely, is further adventurism. We can see the geostrategic adventurism that Iran is engaging in around the region, already dominating Gaza Strip through sponsorship of Hamas with weapons and training and funding. Hezbollah to the north of Israel, which maybe didn't get quite as much of a windfall in recent years with Iranian commitments elsewhere in Syria and to this nuclear weapons program. They can expect more. And as a matter of fact, its Secretary General, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, recently spoke publicly and issued a statement saying that he's looking forward to that release of formerly frozen funds back to Iran, because he and his organization, Hezbollah, expect to benefit from that. So we can expect that kind of adventurism and then move around the Gulf, or the region outside of the Persian Gulf to Yemen, where we can see adventurism and the support of the Houthi rebels there. That will likely be continued, and these funds, if released, would add to that. And certainly more of the funding would go into its WMD programs. We're focused here today on its nuclear weapons program, which will, of course, get a big boost. But let's not forget that Iran has a highly advanced, sophisticated biological weapons program and chemical weapons program, too.
Thank you. Admiral Lyons?
Yeah. Just want to, where the $50 billion that our leader will so generously release to Iran, it shouldn't go there at all. Let me tell you where it should go. It should go to the surviving families of our 241 Marines that were killed, and to the families of the 3,000 Americans that were killed on 9/11. Now, Judge Royce Lamberth found Iran guilty for the Marine barracks blow-up in October 23rd, 1983. In fact, I testified during that trial. And it was Federal Judge George Daniel, U.S. District Southern Court in December 2011, who found Iran culpable and guilty in the 9/11 attack. That's where the money should go.
Yeah. I happen to lead that investigation on behalf of the plaintiffs' attorneys, and we presented quite a bit of unusual and unique evidence from defectors from Iranian intelligence, as well as direct material evidence of Iran's engagement in that. One terrorist attack, and a quick point to make that we have not talked about, is Iran's involvement in Benghazi. And I've written a book, Dark Forces, The Truth About What Happened in Benghazi, which lays out Iran's presence on the ground in Benghazi. It was known to the U.S. intelligence community. There were something like 50 to 60 briefing papers that were presented by the CIA and by AFRICOM to American leaders, including to Ambassador Chris Stevens in June of 2012, just a few months before the attacks. They knew that Iran was on the ground in Benghazi. They knew that they had recruited Sunni militiamen under a group called Ansar al-Sharia, which they had created and funded in Benghazi. They knew that there was a senior Hezbollah leader on the ground leading the operations, and they knew in the end that the Iranians had sent a two-star Revolutionary Guards general named Mohsen Rabbani under cover of a Red Crescent medical team to Benghazi at the end of July of 2012. He was kidnapped off the streets, in quotes, turned out he was kidnapped by the militiamen he had, in fact, paid and trained and was continuing to fund for this operation. I guarantee you for the next 6 weeks, when he was off the streets, he had 3 square meals a day and clean sheets every night. And on the night of the attacks, on September 11th, 2012, that took the lives of 4 Americans in Benghazi, he was across the street on the roof watching the operation and giving the orders. So that is another terrorist attack by the Iranian regime that took the lives of Americans that we have not yet taken a look at. I hope this is going to come out in Trey Gowdy's hearings. I know that they have been asking for some of the briefings from the executive branch, and so far they've not gotten a response.
I guess implicit in what we're talking about here, but it warrants being made explicit, is that this kind of behavior on the part of the world's only superpower at the hands of a third-rate power with great ambitions only inspires their contempt and emboldens them. They have ambitions, as I say, to be perhaps what they once were, a great civilization and power. They certainly have the impetus of Sharia and jihad animating that aspiration at the moment. But I think it's hard to overstate the implications of what we are inviting in the way of still worse behavior by the lack of a response on our part to what has been done so far. Maybe in closing, I could ask each of you just to speculate on 2 points. One, is this likely to get any better in the next 2 months? Are the kinds of concerns that we have been expressing here going to be replaced by a more robust negotiation on our part as a result of the Senate's action yesterday and the House action perhaps next week? And secondly, if you would, and each of you have a different perspective on this, but I think it's important to just put a fine point on this. We've talked about the extent to which this regime is hostile not just to Israel or the Jews, not just to some of its Sunni neighbors, but to us. To the point where they have, in the words of Ahmadinejad, talked openly, not just about death to America, which is of course a standard incantation, but about a world without America being not only desirable but achievable. And my question is, are we looking at a regime that is not only emboldened by all of this, but is convinced all the more that the kind of end times scenario that the so-called Twelvers embrace is now in play? Would you comment on that, particularly in the context of what we've talked about this bomb and EMP and so on?
Yeah. Ayatollah Khomeini had a phrase early on during the hostage crisis in 1979. He said, "America can do nothing." And it was a way of dismissing us, saying that we were weak, we were ineffective, we lacked resolve, we had no backbone. And it's a phrase that did not die with Khomeini. Iran's current generation of leaders say exactly the same thing. Mohsen Rezai, who was the commander of the Revolutionary Guards in 1983 during the attacks in Lebanon, he watched us leave Beirut with the Marines, pull out with our tail between our legs, literally, in February of 1984. And he said, well, America can do nothing. You hit them and they leave. And that was under President Reagan. That was under President Reagan. Now, it's become a joke. Remember during the 2009 demonstrations in Tehran and other cities around Iran, 3 million people in the streets holding up signs in English, "Obama, are you with us?" Just so CNN and the other news cameras would get the point. And Obama, of course, said nothing. And finally, when he did open his mouth, he said, well, America has a bad history of intervening in Iran's domestic politics, so we're not going to do it. That sounded the death knell to the Green Movement's momentum. And the Iranian regime took that to the bank, and then you had regime officials going on TV holding up a picture of Obama and making a play on words. Instead of saying Obama, they said Ubamast, which means he's with us. They said Obama, he's with us. And the people of Iran got it. They got the point. America has always been the great hope, the flag of freedom for Iran. Today, that flag of freedom is not at half-staff. That flag of freedom had been brought all the way down to the ground. It's a tragic circumstance for us as Americans. It's even more tragic for people who have looked up to us around the world to hold high that flag of freedom.
Well, I can only second what Ken had to say. And again, I take you back to the secret negotiations that were conducted before he ever became president. He said, "You're going to like my policies." Of course, we're seeing they couldn't be happier. And that he's a friend of Iran. It said it all. And we're seeing it played out day by day, and the regretful part is, you know, in the 2014 elections, the change in leadership was made not so Congress would work with this president, but they would stop his fundamental transformation of America. Regretfully, our leadership doesn't have that message. And something dramatic must take place to change the course that we're on today.
Claire?
What I would say is that when a great power like the United States loses credibility in the general perspective of the world, in the general perception around the world, to get it back costs so much more than the actions that would have maintained it in the first place. What I mean is that in order to regain credibility that we indeed have lost, we're going to have to take action that is so much more resolute, so much more even aggressive than we would have prior to having let that credibility go. And in the meantime, the perception by those who would be aggressors in the world, the bullies, the adventurers, Putin in Russia, the Chinese, and of course the Iranians, the perception by them that we do still have power but are not willing to use it makes for a very dangerous and unstable situation in which they will continue to push and push and push the envelope to see how far they can get before they'll get a response out of us. And if they reach the point that they conclude we can do anything we want and they're not going to respond, we're not going to respond, then that sense of impunity on their part could be very dangerous, with or without an apocalyptic vision on the part of the Iranian regime. The thought that accelerating the return of the Imam, the 12th Imam, might be accomplished by instigating chaos and strife, warfare on earth. Even if you discount that or set that aside and say, well, they don't really mean that, simply the perception, allowing them the perception that they can act with impunity will embolden them in a very destabilizing way, certainly in the region, and perhaps much further abroad, even all the way to our own shores.
Thank you. Let's take any questions you may have in the audience. Yes, ma'am. Let me put my 2 bits in and then invite my colleagues. My concern is that what we are doing with the way the Corker-Cardin bill is teeing up the congressional role is essentially a one-way mission. I don't see undoing this. Now, there is some talk that if it's not a treaty and it's not been ratified, then it could be undone by the next president. But as one of the sponsors of this legislation, Senator Cardin, was saying on the radio this morning, he doesn't think it's going to work that way. He thinks that we will be effectively locked in by virtue of the international support for this deal, or by the lack of evidence that it's come a cropper, or by the fact that there isn't a will at that point to take the steps that this administration has already made abundantly clear there's no will to take now, which is the kind of military action that Admiral Lyons was talking about. So all of that is operating, and one can debate it, but I think that's a realistic assessment of the politics of it. What is indisputable is that the sanctions, which are unraveling now as we speak, make no mistake about it. You have, as I'm sure Ken can talk about, international businessmen from all over the world,
including the United States,
beating the path to Tehran for the purposes of making deals, and their governments are attentive to their desire to make money, and they will not reverse course, most especially the Russians, most especially the Chinese, who are, of course, the two principally problematic veto-wielding powers. But I don't think the Europeans are going to be any help either. And once that is really back to sort of the status quo ante, prior to 6, was it, UN resolutions, and prior to the European Union adopting sanctions, this idea that there will be a snap back of sanctions is an insult to the intelligence of the American people. And I must say, the only thing that comes close to it, in my estimation, is the insult that we're now being served up, that thanks to the Corker-Cardin bill, the Congress of the United States will have a meaningful vote on this deal. I think both of these are frauds that are being perpetrated on the public, and perhaps to our great detriment. Yeah. Other comments?
Yep. We threw away a winning hand. We had everything behind us. 10 years of international support, as Frank mentioned, 6 UN Security Council resolutions, 5 of which included sanctions, and the recognition in writing, supported by all the members of the Security Council, that Iran had violated the Treaty on Non-Proliferation on Nuclear Weapons, the NPT, and therefore had no rights under the treaty to any nuclear technology whatsoever. That was done. We had accomplished that. And it was accomplished by the president, who is accused by his opponents of being the most unilateral president in the history of the United States, and yet he mustered an international coalition to go to the United Nations under John Bolton to get some of those UN Security Council resolutions to block Iran's nuclear weapons program. We threw that away. We had reduced Iran's oil exports by half. We caused serious pain, not to the Iranian people so much as to the regime that no longer could take their kickbacks in suitcases to banks in Switzerland, where they would be sending their children to, for private education, while the rest of the Iranian people were starving and didn't even have clean water in the suburbs of Tehran. All right? So we caused them real pain through our actions. But I have high confidence. I have high confidence in the willingness of the Iranian regime, the confidence and the arrogance of the Iranian regime to spit in our faces and to spit on the agreement and to violate it at every possible occasion, even before, not before the ink is dry, before the ink has even been signed, because they are already violating the agreement. If you listen to what they say in Tehran about this agreement, it bears no relationship whatsoever to what the U.S. Secretary of State is saying, or what the French Foreign Minister is saying, or any of the other leaders involved in the negotiations are saying. So unless Congress decides to play deaf, dumb, and blind, which is always possible, I believe that Congress has a duty, and it's written into this bill, to monitor very closely and demand monitoring by the administration, whether the White House likes it or not, of Iran's behavior, their actions under this agreement. And of course, when we have a real president of the United States again, who respects America's sovereignty, who believes in American exceptionalism, who understands what that means, and understands our role in the world, he will take, or she will take, the appropriate steps on the first or second or third day of office on this executive agreement. The only advantage to it being an executive agreement and not being a treaty is that the next president has the authority to reverse it immediately.
Let me just say, and I agree with what Ken had to say. However, you know, all is not lost. You just saw, you know, the UN had an agreement to, they passed a resolution to prevent all arms, further arms into Yemen. And of course, in just thumbing their nose fashion, the Iranians sent a convoy of 6 ships escorted by 2 naval vessels. And just flaunt the UN resolution, meant nothing to them. Until we redeployed the carrier strike group, Abraham Lincoln and the USS Normandy. That movement and sent the message, and symbols still matter throughout the Middle East. So when we will take a positive action, you can change Iranian behavior. Whether we will sustain this for the next 18 months, that's an open question. But you can make them change in certain direct ways.
I know Claire wants to get in on this. Could I just ask, though, before turning it over to her, Admiral, on that point, you mentioned what happened off the coast of Yemen. What about what didn't happen in the Strait of Hormuz when there was similar provocative behavior by the Iranians?
Yeah. Well, of course, I did an op-ed on this, and obviously the Iranians were embarrassed by our movement, and they were outflanked on that particular venture. However, in true fashion, they turned right around and committed an act of piracy by firing shots across the I can't think of the name of the ship, Maersk Tigers container ship, boarded the ship, took control, and took it into the port of Bandar Abbas. Now, as I understand it, we had F-18s overhead monitoring the operation. I ask you this, had we let go with several 500-pound laser-guided bombs and taken out those Iranian patrol craft, you think the situation had been changed? I think it would have turned it around. But again, we didn't act.
Claire.
My concern about the agreement as such, or whatever it is to be, is not that the Iranians will break it, but that they'll keep it. But at the same time, the covert program will continue, the one that we don't even address, we don't even talk about. They could actually keep every provision of what we understand may be the outline of this framework agreement and still come up with a deliverable nuclear weapon in very short order because we are not talking about the covert program.
Could you speak to that just a little bit more, because we sort of have touched on it, I think, each of us in turn, but you with your background in intelligence specifically, Claire, there are so many statements being made by the administration about this agreement. And we've tried to truth squad many of them here and in the previous session. But specifically, insidious, it seems to me, is the series of representations about this agreement having the most intrusive, comprehensive, anywhere, anytime inspection regime in history. I see no evidence that that's true, but both, again, on the basis of what you know from your study of this agreement and this administration's conduct, but more specifically, what you know about the history of arms control verification. Do you make of these kinds of statements?
Well, I don't see any evidence of a commitment to open up sites that have been closed to inspection. You know, FARDO is part of this series of negotiations and discussions. But if you look closely at either the United States version of the framework agreement of the 1st of April or the Iranian one, there is absolutely zero mention in either version of those points that there will be on-site inspections inside FARDO. There are discussions about FARDO being transformed into its centrifuges turned to peaceful uses and not to be used anymore for spinning up uranium or enriching uranium. But there is absolutely nothing so far in the points, American or Farsi, Iranian version, that says there will be intrusive inspections inside of FARDO. It's not in there. Now that's just FARDO. There are other sites about which the IAEA and the rest of us have many concerns. Parchin is one of those sites. Parchin is a military Iranian site which was revealed quite some time ago and suspected by the IAEA of being the site for the testing of explosives that would be used to set off the chain reaction of a nuclear warhead, trigger testing. And satellite photography, which is openly available on the internet, confirms that there are structures, or were structures, at Parchin that looked like the kinds of structures that would be used for explosives testing. Now, subsequent to those discussions coming public, satellite photography then revealed that the Iranians did something they'd done before, and that is they destroyed part of the Parchin facility, including a number of buildings, and satellite photography imagery was able to show the evidence of heavy earth-moving tracks in the dirt at Parchin. This is a redux of what they did in 2003 and 4 with the razing to the ground of another facility called Lavizan Shi'an, revealed by the Iranian opposition and refused for IAEA inspection until they had made sure that there would be no evidence found there of what they were doing, which the IAEA believes was nuclear warhead R&D. That's 2003. That's 15 years ago. There are other sites revealed since, places like Khondab, under mountains, underground, and bunkers. Ken mentioned our mutual friend Reza Khalili, who talked about this particular site as an enrichment site, a centrifuge site. Nobody's even mentioned it. There are other sites revealed more recently. Lavizan 3 is one of those, more recently revealed by the Iranian opposition, a centrifuge enrichment site. So none of these sites has even been discussed, even brought up in the talks as a place for intrusive inspections of any kind, much less spot inspections or no-notice inspections, the kind that must be allowed if Iran's program is truly to be open and transparent, as everybody says they want it to be.
Everybody except the Iranian regime, of course, when they're speaking in Farsi for their own purposes. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Great questions. We happen to have one of the country's preeminent authorities on the Iran lobby here with Clare Lopez, and perhaps others of you would like to comment as well, but let me start with Clare.
Well, excellent question, of course. And when you look at the total reversal of U.S. policy towards Iran from a position of you will not enrich uranium, we will make sure that you will not have a nuclear weapon, to the kinds of negotiations that are providing concession after concession that are guaranteed to pave the way to acquisition by the Iranians of a deliverable nuclear weapon, you have to ask, how did that flip? How did American foreign policy on Iran flip completely 180 degrees? And I think the Iran lobby has to be part of the answer to that. You asked about counterintelligence capability. I'll mention something here. I used to teach at a facility that had students from the intelligence community among our group, and I taught a course on the Iranian intelligence and security services. And when I got to the part about influence operations and agents of influence, and I would ask them, how would you recognize these things if they were to take place in your organization? And I very quickly realized they had no idea what I was talking about. And I had to begin with a vocabulary lesson. What is an influence operation? What is an agent of influence? These are top analysts with top secret security clearances at the top levels. Well, they were a range of experience levels, but throughout our intelligence community. And then I got to discussing what must be considered a very successful intelligence operation by the Iranian regime, the Iran lobby establishment or network here in the United States. And this is a network of individuals, groups, former ambassadors, former oil executives, journalists, analysts, think tanks, under the leadership of something called NIAC, N-I-A-C, or National Iranian American Council. And it is led by an Iranian-born individual named Trita Parsi. And so I would describe all of this to my classes and tell them that Trita Parsi was a good example of an intelligence agent of influence for the Iranian regime. And on more than one occasion, it was the student from the CIA who waved his hand in the air. Oh, no, that couldn't possibly be true. Trita Parsi couldn't possibly be an agent of influence. He comes out to Langley and he lectures to us. I'll let it go at that.
Well, you mustn't, because one of the other aspects of this negotiation has been the prominent role played in it by Trita Parsi, including a statement that I think you called to my attention, Claire, or maybe it was Fred Fleitz, one of our other colleagues who couldn't be here today, to the effect that on a Facebook page, in the midst of the negotiations, he revealed that he had just realized that he had missed lunch because he was too busy, quote, gloating, unquote, about what had been done in the negotiating process in which he was actually participating in some extent. This is a counterintelligence problem of the first order, but unfortunately it doesn't entirely rest with the effectiveness of this Iran lobby. And by the way, Claire has done a marvelous white paper several years ago now, but I think it's held up very well on this apparatus. But it obviously is in part successful because of the degree to which the administration is enabling it, embracing it, putting its people into positions of trust, having them brief, having them, sit in on the negotiations, what have you. Ken?
I can tell you an anecdote just to sort of illustrate how deep, how far they are willing to go, and the extent of the efforts that they will make, and the players that they target. Many years ago now, 15 years ago, I was a Republican candidate for the United States Senate in the state of Maryland. And I ran my campaign on a shoestring out of my house. And one of the volunteers we had was an aging gentleman. I will not mention his name. But I later discovered that his son was the lawyer for Trita Parsi. Okay. I later discovered that. Now, you say, oh, well, just a coincidence, nothing very important. And he was a very nice gentleman. I enjoyed his company. A few years after the campaign, another friend of mine who was going back and forth to Tehran. He had been a university professor before the regime changed in 1979. He went back to see his former students, including some who were now in senior positions in Iranian intelligence. And one of these guys at dinner said, oh, you know, you've got that friend Timmerman in Washington, right? And he said, yeah, I got this friend Timmerman, of course. I mentioned that to you before. He said, well, here, I want to show you this file. And he passed a file to him which had pictures of the basement of my house where we had installed a sauna. And they said, oh, it's this guy, Mr. P, who had given us those photos to show that he could penetrate the entourage of Mr. Timmerman in Washington. That's how far they will go in their efforts, both to collect intelligence. Now, that was a quote-unquote intelligence gathering operation, but also to engage in influence of members of Congress and otherwise. So it is an extensive, deep, well-resourced effort, and they are here.
You know, speaking about officials in key positions, you heard earlier reference here to Ambassador William Miller, who on behalf of then candidate Barack Obama in 2008, told the regime in Tehran that were he to become president, things would be you know, much easier between us. Well, he's not the only one at that level to engage in these kinds of activities. There have been people affiliated with NIAC, for instance, who've actually held positions, and currently the current Iran desk officer at the National Security Council is a former employee of NIAC. Former other State Department officials have been in and out between NIAC and the State Department, including Iran desk officer in the Near East Bureau of the State Department. This is how close these relationships are, and these are the marks of a remarkably successful intelligence operation. We want to know what happened to American foreign policy on Iran. Influence operations writ large.
You need to, you know, Tom Pickering is not an unknown name to you. Yeah, well, he's part of it. I mean, that tells you, should tell you how far this reach goes.
But of course, we don't have any proof that people from the NSC or from NIAC have disclosed any classified information.
It's not a point. I would suggest that the issue is not a question only of the potential for disclosure of classified information from inside U.S. Channels, but rather that individuals like this person at the NSC could be perceived by the Iranians as a channel for influence operations, and may indeed actually operate that way. So it is a two-way street that people sometimes don't think about. It's not just that secrets may be taken out, but that influence may flow in, and that's more to my point about what's happened to American foreign policy, is that influence operation coming into the top ranks of our national security.
And the other influence one we shouldn't overlook is the Muslim Brotherhood, which you got a dual-edged sword here, and their influence has been grown by leaps and bounds under this administration.
That is a subject for another day's convention of this group. But let me just close by saying, I think what we've just touched on, and forgive me, to those of you listening from outside of the room, I failed in making up for the lack of a microphone for those of you in the room, but I hope you were able to make sense of the questions by virtue of the very good answers that were given. Just a couple of quick points in closing. Claire talked about the verification problem, as have several of us. An additional facet of this, of course, is even if you are actually able to catch the Iranians in some transgression on the terms of the deal that we have gotten them to agree to with the part of the program that is now above board, the question occurs, will this administration do anything about it? And I just commend to you the recent experience with, after many years of ignoring Russian violations of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, they now have acknowledged the violation and they refuse to do anything about it. Anything, other than try to negotiate some more with the Russians. If I could just sort of summarize our purpose today, and I think the cumulative points that have been made, it is this. We are dealing with national security fraud on the part of the Obama administration and its apologists or champions with regard to this agreement. It will not prevent Iran from getting the bomb. Period. It has not foreclosed all of the avenues by which they can get the bomb. Period. We will not be able to know with certitude how fast they're moving to take advantage of the opportunities that remain, many, to get the bomb. We will not see this terrible danger of a nuclear weapon, which the administration, specifically the president, has repeatedly promised to keep from coming to pass, actually translate into a more peaceful region, let alone more secure world. To the contrary, for, again, the several reasons that have been mentioned here, we will see it become more dangerous, more riddled with nuclear-capable nations. And one of the things that just, I think it bears saying, there is not one of the nations in the region, with the possible exception of Iran, that will have, presumably, nuclear weapons in the near term, about whom you can confidently say the government that gets the nuclear weapons will remain in power once they have them. They're all beset by insurgencies, external or internal, or the problem of simply difficult situations, economic and otherwise, that can give rise to some very bad actors. If the governments in question aren't bad enough, in some cases, very bad actors getting these weapons. So this is, again, served up as, I hope, the kind of basis that those of us who are working these issues are able to communicate to those who will be considering the Corker-Cardin bill specifically, and more generally this nuclear deal in the United States House of Representatives next week. And I would just say in closing personally that I pray that the House in its deliberations will be informed by more realism and less fraud than we saw in the Senate. And that if those of you who are listening are moved by what you've heard about the implications of this fraud, will share your concerns with your elected representatives, I think we'll have a better outcome in the House than we did in the Senate. With that, I thank you very much for participating, particularly my colleagues, Ken Timmerman, Admiral A. Lyons, Clare Lopez, and those of you in the room and elsewhere for taking aboard this really important Truth Squad information. For my own self, the Center for Security Policy, Frank Gaffney, thanks so much for participating.